October 1945, a temporary holding camp near the Rhine. The rain had stopped, but the mud remained. Rows of canvas tents sagged under cold morning light, their ropes creaking in a steady wind. Inside a processing barrack, a line of women stood silently, hands clasped, coats pulled tight against the chill. Former nurses, clerks, telephone operators, some barely in their 20s. A wooden table divided them from the Allied guards. Piles of belongings lay sorted in careful stacks: watches, letters, rings, and photographs. One by one, the items were handed back. Many expected nothing. During the war, possessions had meant suspicion. Memories were dangerous things, evidence of a past that had collapsed overnight. Then an interpreter spoke quietly. "You may keep your family photographs." The words hung in the air longer than any command. A woman hesitated before taking the small bundle. Her thumb traced the worn edge of a picture. A mother, a child, a summer day untouched by war. Her shoulders trembled. No one spoke. Even the guards grew still. For some, this was the first sign that captivity would not mean the erasure of who they had been. And that moment would reveal a very different kind of post-war battle. May 1945. In Europe, the war ended, not with a single decisive moment, but with exhaustion. Cities burned out, roads crowded with refugees, armies collapsing faster than they could retreat. When Germany signed unconditional surrender on May 8th, millions of soldiers and civilians found themselves suddenly displaced in a continent of ruins. Among them were women, a group rarely centered in conventional narratives of surrender. During the final years of the war, the German state had expanded female participation far beyond traditional roles. Women served as nurses in field hospitals, clerks in military offices, radio operators, anti-aircraft auxiliaries, and administrative staff attached to the Wehrmacht and various paramilitary organizations. They were not frontline combat troops in large numbers, but they were deeply embedded in the machinery of total war. As Allied armies advanced from east and west, many of these women were caught in the collapse. Some were captured alongside retreating units. Others surrendered while attempting to flee toward western zones, hoping to avoid Soviet capture. The result was a scattered population of female detainees suddenly under Allied control, American, British, French, and Soviet alike. The Western Allies faced a logistical challenge unlike anything seen before. Europe was overflowing with displaced persons. Prisoners of war numbered in the millions. Camps had to be created quickly, often by repurposing former German military installations, abandoned airfields, or open farmland surrounded by temporary fencing. Within these camps, policy was shaped not only by military necessity, but by international law. The 1929 Geneva Convention required humane treatment of prisoners, food, shelter, medical care, and the preservation of personal property whenever possible. Yet the reality was complicated. Screening and denazification processes meant that personal items were often inspected, recorded, or temporarily removed. Photographs, letters, and identification papers could be viewed as intelligence material or proof of affiliation. For many German women entering captivity, this uncertainty was terrifying. Propaganda throughout the war had portrayed Allied forces as ruthless occupiers. Rumors spread quickly, stories of humiliation, confiscation, or punishment. Some women burned diaries before surrender. Others hid family photographs in clothing seams or beneath bandages, afraid they might be destroyed. The psychological landscape was equally unstable. Germany's defeat shattered more than military power. It broke social identity. Many female personnel had spent years believing they were part of a disciplined national effort. Suddenly they were labeled enemy nationals, watched by guards wearing unfamiliar uniforms and speaking unfamiliar languages. Inside the camps, silence was common. Interpreters later recalled that groups of German women often spoke in whispers or avoided conversation entirely during their first weeks. Some refused eye contact, others remained rigidly formal, continuing military habits long after the war had ended, standing at attention during roll calls, keeping uniforms neatly pressed even when supplies were scarce. American officers observed this behavior with curiosity. Compared to male POWs, who sometimes argued politics or asked questions, many women seemed withdrawn, carrying a quiet weight that extended beyond fear. They worried about families lost in bombing raids, husbands missing at the front, children whose whereabouts were unknown, and above all, they worried about memory. In a Europe where borders had shifted and entire neighborhoods disappeared overnight, photographs were often the last tangible proof that a previous life had existed. Allied administrators eventually realized that preserving personal identity could reduce tension inside camps. Allowing prisoners to keep certain belongings, especially non-political items like family photographs, became a subtle but important policy decision. It aligned with Geneva regulations, but it also served a practical purpose. Prisoners who felt recognized as human beings were less likely to resist or become psychologically unstable. Still, implementation varied by location. Some camps returned belongings immediately. Others delayed until screening was complete. In processing centers along the Rhine and in southern Germany, tables were set up where captured items were sorted and handed back one by one. For many prisoners, that moment was deeply emotional. In a world where everything had been lost, homes, certainty, ideology, a small photograph became a lifeline. American guards, many of whom were young men seeing Europe for the first time, were often unprepared for the intensity of these reactions. A woman receiving a faded picture might tremble. Another might cry silently, hiding tears behind gloved hands. Some simply stared at the image for minutes, as if trying to confirm it was real. These scenes were. By the summer of 1945, the Allied occupation of Germany had entered a new phase. The fighting was over, but the real work, reconstruction, stabilization, and psychological transition was only beginning. For the United States Army, prisoner of war camps were no longer viewed solely as temporary holding areas. They became controlled environments where the first experiments in post-war reorientation quietly unfolded. Military leadership understood that Europe's future would depend not only on dismantling armies, but on reshaping attitudes, particularly among those who had lived within the ideological structure of the Third Reich. Women detainees occupied a complicated position inside this process. Unlike high-ranking male officers or known political leaders, most female POWs and auxiliaries posed little military threat. Yet their experiences were deeply tied to wartime institutions, field hospitals, communications networks, administrative offices. Many had witnessed the collapse of Germany from inside its military system, and now stood uncertain about how they would be judged. Processing centers in the American zone began developing routines intended to balance security with dignity. Upon arrival, prisoners were searched and catalogued. Uniform insignia were often removed. Personal belongings were inspected for intelligence value. Maps, documents, and political material separated from personal effects. Photographs, however, created an unusual dilemma. They were deeply private, yet potentially revealing. Pictures could show family members, military gatherings, or ideological symbols. Some intelligence officers argued for strict confiscation. Others pushed for return once screening was complete, noting that personal objects helped maintain calm and order among detainees. Gradually, a practical consensus emerged. Where possible, family photographs would be returned. The decision seemed small, administrative, even routine. But inside the camps, the emotional consequences were profound. Many German women had entered captivity, believing that everything associated with their previous lives would be erased. Cities lay in ruins. Communication systems were broken. Millions of civilians were missing or displaced. For some, a photograph was the only evidence that loved ones still existed somewhere beyond the fences. When guards handed these items back, reactions varied. Some women thanked the guards softly, struggling with English words they barely understood. Others accepted the photographs with rigid formality, unwilling to show emotion in front of the enemy. A few turned away immediately, retreating to bunks to examine the images in private light. American camp staff began noticing a subtle change afterward. Women who had remained withdrawn began speaking quietly among themselves. Groups formed around shared stories, pointing at photographs, identifying relatives, describing towns now reduced to rubble. In some cases, guards observed that tension inside barracks eased. The photographs provided conversation without politics, memory without ideology. Meanwhile, Allied occupation authorities were facing a broader challenge across Germany itself. The policy of denazification sought to remove extremist influence, but it also risked creating a population defined entirely by guilt and collapse. American psychologists and military planners debated how to manage this transition. Too much humiliation could produce resentment. Too little accountability could allow dangerous ideas to persist. Within POW camps, small acts of controlled humanity became part of this balance. Allowing prisoners to maintain fragments of personal identity, letters, photographs, religious items aligned with a growing realization that dignity and order were closely linked. Guards were instructed to remain professional, avoid unnecessary cruelty, and enforce discipline without personal hostility. For many American soldiers, this was unfamiliar territory. They had spent years fighting a brutal enemy. Now they were expected to guard that enemy without vengeance. Some adapted easily, others struggled. Yet moments involving family photographs often cut through that distance. A guard seeing a prisoner holding a picture of children or parents recognized something universal. The war's abstraction dissolved briefly into shared human experience. This quiet shift mirrored larger changes happening across occupied Europe. In displaced persons camps, aid organizations like the Red Cross and church groups began emphasizing emotional stabilization alongside material relief. The lesson was increasingly clear. Rebuilding societies required more than infrastructure. It required rebuilding personal identity. Inside the wire, the same logic applied. Female POWs especially those who had served as nurses or clerks, often found themselves reflecting on roles they might occupy after release. Without the uniform's authority, who would they become? Teachers? Mothers? Refuge? Inside the women's compounds, time moved slowly. Days were measured by roll calls, meals, and the quiet drift of conversation. For many German female POWs, captivity felt less like imprisonment and more like suspension, an uncertain pause between a destroyed past and an unknown future. In that space, photographs took on extraordinary weight. A small black and white image folded inside a coat pocket could hold an entire world. A husband in civilian clothes before conscription. Children standing in front of a house that might now be rubble. A summer lake that no longer existed except in memory. These pictures were not political symbols. They were fragments of ordinary life. And ordinary life was precisely what war had erased. Many women had gone months, sometimes years, without direct contact with family. Postal systems were shattered. Cities were cut off by occupation zones. Rumors traveled faster than truth. A photograph became the closest thing to proof that their old reality had been real. American camp staff gradually observed something difficult to quantify, but impossible to ignore. Women who clutched photographs often appeared calmer. They spoke more quietly. They argued less. Emotional outbursts declined. The images grounded them. One interpreter later recalled seeing a woman sit for hours staring at a worn family portrait, tracing the edge of the paper as if memorizing its texture. She did not cry. She simply held the photograph as though it anchored her to a timeline that had not entirely vanished. This was the first subtle change. Not political, not ideological. Human. The war had stripped identity down to uniforms and classifications. A photograph restored individuality, and with that individuality came a fragile but growing sense that life might continue after captivity. The relationship between captor and captive during World War II had rarely been defined by empathy. German propaganda had portrayed Americans as culturally inferior, overly soft, undisciplined. Many prisoners arrived in camp expecting harsh treatment, or at least indifference. Instead, they encountered something unexpected. American military policy emphasized adherence to the Geneva Convention. Prisoners received food, medical care, and structured routines. Guards were instructed to maintain discipline without cruelty. Personal belongings were catalogued, not destroyed. For women shaped by the rigid hierarchy of wartime Germany, this approach felt confusing. Some interpreted it as manipulation. Others viewed it as weakness. But gradually, perception began to shift. When American guards returned family photographs rather than discarding them, the gesture challenged deeply held assumptions. The enemy, victorious, armed, and in complete control, had chosen restraint over humiliation. This contrast carried symbolic power. In German military culture, authority often demonstrated itself through severity. Here, authority appeared almost casual. Guards joked among themselves. They respected schedules but did not enforce rituals of submission. Prisoners were expected to follow rules, yet were still treated as individuals. For many women, this was disorienting. One former auxiliary later described feeling embarrassed by kindness. She had prepared herself for suffering, not civility. The return of her family picture felt like an emotional contradiction, an acknowledgement of humanity from someone she had been taught to hate. Small moments accumulated, a guard handing back a photograph without comment, another pausing while a prisoner carefully folded an image before inspection ended. No speeches, no gestures of reconciliation, just routine acts that slowly eroded the emotional distance constructed by years of propaganda. The cultural shock was subtle, but transformative. Dignity, it turned out, did not always require hierarchy or fear, and that realization unsettled many more deeply than confinement itself. From the outside, returning personal photographs looked like a simple humanitarian choice. Inside military offices, however, it reflected calculated policy decisions shaped by both practicality and strategy. American occupation planners understood that Germany's collapse created a dangerous vacuum. Millions of soldiers and civilians faced uncertainty. Political identity was fractured. Stability would depend on preventing bitterness from hardening into future extremism. POW camps became testing grounds for how defeated populations might respond to controlled fairness. Military psychologists and intelligence officers studied prisoner behavior closely. Reports noted that excessive punishment often increased resistance, while structured dignity encouraged compliance. Small personal freedoms, supervised reading, religious practice, access to personal effects appeared to reduce disciplinary problems. Photographs fit naturally into this framework. They carried little intelligence risk once screened, yet emotionally they mattered immense. Inside captivity, memory could be both refuge and burden. For many German women held in Allied camps, the war had ended externally but not internally. They carried layers of loss that could not be spoken aloud. Husbands missing on the Eastern Front, parents buried under bombed streets, children evacuated to unknown locations. Silence became a survival instinct. Photographs pierced that silence. When camp officials allowed women to keep family pictures, they unintentionally reopened emotional pathways that had been sealed shut for survival. A single image could trigger waves of memory, not only tenderness, but guilt. Why had they survived when others had vanished? What kind of home awaited them, if any existed at all? Psychologists observing post-war prisoners noticed this tension. Some women became withdrawn, spending hours looking at photographs in private corners of barracks. Others began to talk more openly, sharing stories about families or towns destroyed during air raids. The photographs transformed abstract grief into something tangible. Before, loss had existed as uncertainty. With an image in hand, the past gained shape again. It reminded them that they had once belonged somewhere beyond barbed wire. This subtle emotional reawakening reduced despair. Camp records showed declines in disciplinary incidents and depression-related health complaints in groups where personal belongings remained intact. Memory, once suppressed, began functioning as therapy. No formal counseling existed. No therapeutic language framed these experiences, yet the effect resembled healing, fragile, inconsistent, but visible. The war had stripped away certainty. A photograph quietly restored continuity, and continuity gave prisoners something powerful, the ability to imagine a future that extended beyond captivity. Much of this transformation rested not on policy alone, but on the behavior of individual American guards, young men who themselves were adapting to an unexpected post-war reality. Many had spent years expecting combat, not custody. Instead of firing rifles, they now supervised prisoners, distributed meals, and maintained order among people they had once seen only as enemies. Their instructions emphasized professionalism, yet personal reactions varied widely. Some guards remained distant, others grew quietly curious. They noticed that the women guarded their photographs carefully, folding them into cloth or slipping them beneath mattresses. Over time, small interactions emerged. A guard waiting while a prisoner retrieved a picture before barracks inspection, or pausing during translation to ensure she understood her items would be returned. These moments were not acts of friendship. They were acknowledgments of shared humanity. One former guard later wrote that the strangest part of duty was realizing how ordinary the prisoners seemed. They looked tired. They worried about family. They laughed quietly among themselves. The enemy image created during wartime dissolved into something more complicated. For the guards, this also became a form of education. Many came from rural America and had never met Europeans before. The camp environment exposed them to unfamiliar languages, customs, and attitudes. Watching prisoners treasure family photographs reminded them of their own homes, parents waiting for letters, girlfriends keeping pictures by their beds. Recognition replaced abstraction. Commanders encouraged emotional distance, but complete separation proved impossible. Shared routines built familiarity. Over months, camps developed rhythms that felt almost domestic in their predictability. Some guards later admitted that the most difficult part of the assignment wasn't maintaining discipline. It was reconciling the war they had fought with the human reality now standing across the fence. The photographs symbolized this conflict perfectly. They were proof that even enemies carried private worlds, and guarding those worlds, rather than destroying them, became part of the strange moral landscape of post-war occupation. Beyond psychology or policy, family photographs evolved into something symbolic. Objects that quietly bridged two collapsing worlds. For the prisoners, the images represented continuity. For the Americans, they became evidence that peace required recognizing individuality within former enemies. In some camps, women traded stories while showing photographs to one another. Without words, they could understand shared experiences. Weddings before the war, children photographed in neat clothing, homes now uncertain. These exchanges created miniature communities built around memory rather than ideology. The pictures also reshaped the meaning of surrender. Military defeat traditionally implied loss of identity, uniforms stripped, symbols removed, history erased. Yet these women retained small pieces of personal narrative. The photographs resisted total dissolution. Historians later described such moments as EA, winter 1945-46. A pale morning settled over a prisoner of war camp in the American Southwest. Frost clung to the edges of canvas tents, and breath lingered in the air like smoke. The war was over, yet routines remained rigid. Roll call, inspections, silence. Inside one women's barracks, inspectors arrived earlier than usual. Word had circulated quietly among the prisoners. Regulations were being reviewed. Personal property lists were under scrutiny again. Rumors spread fast behind wire. Confiscations, repatriation schedules, new restrictions. Nobody knew what would happen. Women stood by their bunks, clutching possessions. Small bags, blankets, folded clothing. Many had already hidden letters or photographs, afraid that changing rules might strip away the last pieces of home. The camp officer entered with 2 American administrators and a translator. Inspection began. Boots moved slowly between rows of beds. Items were lifted, Recorded, placed back. Tension thickened. Eyes followed every gesture. Then the inspectors reached a small tin box sitting beneath one bunk. Inside were photographs, family portraits, creased snapshots, faded wedding pictures wrapped carefully in cloth. The owner, a former communications clerk from Hamburg, stiffened visibly. She expected the worst. Earlier regulations had sometimes treated photographs as questionable material, potential propaganda, or personal records requiring review. Some camps had removed them temporarily. Others had restricted personal keepsakes altogether. The American officer paused. He looked at the images. A man in civilian clothes, 2 children standing beside a bicycle, an elderly mother seated formally, hands folded. Ordinary moments, frozen before collapse. The translator waited, uncertain. Silence stretched across the room. Then, quietly, the officer placed the photographs back into the box. He spoke slowly, so the translator could follow. "They may keep these." The words moved across the barracks like a ripple. Women lifted their heads. For a moment, no one reacted openly. Years of discipline suppressed visible emotion. But the atmosphere shifted instantly, an almost physical easing of breath. The inspection continued. More photographs appeared, hidden in coat linings, tucked inside books, folded between letters. Each time the same decision repeated. Keep them. No confiscations, no restrictions. The message was simple, but its emotional weight was immense. To the American administrators, this decision aligned with evolving policy. Occupation strategy emphasized humane treatment, stability, and gradual psychological transition away from wartime hostility. To the prisoners, it felt almost unimaginable. Many had prepared themselves for loss after loss, surrender, displacement, uncertainty about family. Possessions seemed temporary, fragile, vulnerable to authority. Being told they could keep their photographs contradicted expectations shaped by years of propaganda and fear. Some women avoided eye contact, uncertain whether this was a trick or temporary leniency. Others clutched the photographs tighter, as if protecting them from sudden reversal. One observer later recorded that the room remained unusually quiet after inspectors left. The women did not speak immediately. Instead, they sat on bunks, holding images in their laps. Shock replaced fear. Not celebration, not relief. Something more fragile. Disbelief. They had expected control. Instead, they were being trusted. The decision may seem small in military terms. No treaties changed, no battles were fought. But psychologically, it marked a turning point. For many prisoners, photographs represented continuity of identity. During wartime displacement, names, ranks, and roles had collapsed. Photos anchored them to lives that existed before uniforms and conflict. Allowing those images to remain sent an implicit message: your past still belongs to you. American authorities were beginning to understand that rebuilding post-war stability required more than physical custody. It required emotional recalibration, proving that surrender did not mean total erasure. Inside camps, this principle translated into small acts of dignity. Family photographs became symbols of that shift. Later that evening, barracks lights dimmed. Women sat quietly beneath low bulbs, studying faces preserved on thin paper. Some traced outlines with their fingers. Others wiped dust gently from corners. One prisoner, according to a post-war interview, realized she hadn't looked directly at her husband's photograph since capture. Seeing it again felt both painful and necessary. Another woman placed her photo beside her bunk, like a small altar. Conversations began softly. Where was your family from? How old is your child? When was this taken? Memory returned not as collective ideology, but as personal story. The emotional temperature of the barracks changed. Silence became less heavy, less defensive. Even guards noticed subtle difference. The days following the inspection did not bring sudden transformation. The fences remained, orders continued, lights went out at the same hour each night. But inside the barracks, something subtle had changed. Women began taking out their photographs more frequently, not only in private moments, but quietly, in each other's presence. Images passed carefully from hand to hand. A child smiling beside a river. A wedding portrait taken before blackouts and bombings. A family gathered at a table no longer guaranteed to exist. For many, this was the first time in years they had spoken openly about home. War had taught restraint. Survival required emotional control. But now memory entered the room again, fragile, hesitant, and deeply human. A former nurse from Cologne would later recall that she felt more fear showing her photograph than during capture itself. The image represented vulnerability, yet when she shared it, another prisoner nodded and unfolded her own. The silence between them softened. American guards observed these changes with cautious curiosity. One young corporal later described seeing a group of prisoners gathered around a single photograph during afternoon rest. There was no tension, no argument, only quiet conversation, translated through gestures and occasional words. He realized something important. They were no longer just waiting for time to pass. They were remembering who they were. Camp reports from several installations around the United States noted improved morale and fewer disciplinary incidents among women's compounds during this period. Officials rarely attributed the change to specific causes, but personal narratives suggest otherwise. Allowing prisoners to maintain emotional connections reduced despair. The photographs became anchors, small fragments of normality in an environment defined by uncertainty. To women shaped by wartime ideology, identity had often been tied to duty, sacrifice, and endurance. Capture fractured that identity. Photographs reintroduced something separate from military narratives. Personal life, daughter, sister, mother, wife. These roles had existed long before uniforms or battlefronts. Holding those images reminded them that survival did not erase who they were. Some prisoners began keeping journals again. Others asked interpreters about repatriation procedures, showing renewed interest in future plans. Hope, cautious and fragile, re-entered daily routines. One interpreter later wrote that the photographs seemed to act as bridges between past and future, helping women imagine life after captivity. One evening, a woman known for her rigid silence approached a guard station with a photograph in hand. She did not speak English. Through gestures and fragmented translation, she explained that the picture showed her parents. She wanted to know if letters could still reach Germany. The guard hesitated, then directed her to the camp clerk. It was a simple exchange, but for her it marked a threshold. She was no longer frozen in defeat. She was planning forward. Other women followed. Requests for writing supplies increased. Questions about mail routes, Red Cross correspondence, and repatriation timelines multiplied. The photographs had sparked more than memory. They had restored agency. At the administrative level, American authorities were beginning to recognize that humane treatment carried strategic importance. Occupation planners understood that rebuilding Europe required stabilizing populations psychologically as well as economically. Prisoners who returned home emotionally broken could become sources of instability. Those who maintained dignity and connection might reintegrate more smoothly, allowing family photographs, while small, aligned with these broader goals. Yet on the ground, policy felt personal. No official directive could fully explain the impact of holding a child's image beneath barracks light or seeing a spouse's face after years of separation. These were not political gestures. They were human ones. Gradually, interaction between guards and prisoners changed tone. There were still boundaries, strict and necessary, but suspicion softened. Some guards attempted simple conversation through translators. Prisoners responded cautiously, but no longer turned away completely. Mutual acknowledgement replaced rigid distance. One guard later remembered being shown a photograph of a baby and realizing he had a newborn niece back home the same age. For a moment, war dissolved into shared, ordinary life. That realization lingered. As repatriation lists grew longer through 1946, many women began packing their few possessions. Photographs were wrapped carefully in cloth or placed inside envelopes for protection. Some stitched them into coat linings. Others hid them inside soap tins or notebooks. They feared losing them during transit more than losing clothing or ration items, because by then these photographs represented more than memory. They represent. By late 1946, transport ships began carrying German prisoners, including women classified as auxiliaries, nurses, and civilian support personnel, back across the Atlantic. The voyage home was quiet. There were no ceremonies waiting at the docks, no triumphant parades. Europe was still scarred by bomb craters, hunger, and displacement. Germany itself no longer resembled the country many of them remembered. Cities lay flattened. Rail stations operated among ruins. Families had scattered across occupation zones divided by Allied powers. For many women, repatriation felt less like a homecoming and more like stepping into uncertainty. They disembarked carrying little more than camp-issued clothing, personal items, and the photographs that had survived with them. Those images had become anchors during captivity. Now they were maps guiding them through a shattered homeland. Post-war Germany offered little space for stories about captivity. The nation was preoccupied with survival, securing food, rebuilding homes, navigating political transformation. Conversations about the past often centered on loss or blame, not personal, emotional journeys. Many former prisoners chose silence. Some avoided discussing their time in Allied camps altogether. Others feared being misunderstood or judged for surviving, while so many others had not. Among women especially, expectations of quiet resilience remained strong. A former prisoner later explained in an oral history, "People asked where we were during the war, but they did not ask how we lived afterward." The photographs, once shared in barracks rooms, were now kept private again, stored carefully in drawers or wrapped inside letters. They became personal relics rather than stories told aloud. Yet beneath the silence, the experiences of captivity had changed many of the women in subtle ways. In camps, they had encountered a kind of structured dignity from former enemies, medical treatment, routine, and moments of unexpected compassion. These interactions challenged wartime propaganda and reshaped how some understood authority and humanity. Returning home required adapting once again. Some women became teachers or nurses, drawing quietly from lessons learned during imprisonment about patience and emotional endurance. Others focused entirely on family life, determined to rebuild what war had taken. The photographs remained a constant reminder that identity existed beyond national defeat. They were proof that personal history survived political collapse. Across the Atlantic, the impact of these encounters lingered among American guards and civilian workers as well. Memoirs and letters written years later reveal that many soldiers remembered the women's compounds differently from other duties. Instead of battlefield tension, they recalled quiet moments, translated conversations, shared gestures, and the strange weight of seeing enemy prisoners protect family photographs as if they were sacred objects. Some guards described feeling unease when prisoners departed, a realization that the people they had guarded were not abstractions, but individuals returning to uncertain futures. One former guard wrote in a veteran's newsletter decades later, "We expected resentment. What we saw instead was people trying not to lose themselves." These reflections rarely entered official history books, but they persisted in personal memory. In the decades following the war, traces of these experiences surfaced unexpectedly. Local archives in the United States preserved camp reports mentioning personal belongings and morale improvements linked to humane treatment policies. Oral history projects recorded fragmented memories from both former prisoners and American personnel. Occasionally, researchers discovered photographs preserved by former POWs, worn, creased, but intact. Some images still bore camp inventory marks, silent evidence that they had once been inspected and nearly taken away. Historians began to recognize these small personal objects as powerful historical artifacts. They illustrated a dimension of war often overlooked: emotional survival. The aftermath of captivity did not produce dramatic headlines or political announcements. There were no formal acknowledgments of the psychological impact of allowing prisoners to keep personal photographs. No medals awarded for kindness, yet the effects endured. Women who once feared losing the last visual connection to their families carried those images into new lives. Children and grandchildren later discovered them in old boxes or albums, asking questions that many survivors struggled to answer. For some families, the photographs became the only surviving link between generations separated by war. By the early 1950s, Europe had begun rebuilding. The Cold War reshaped alliances. Former enemies gradually became partners in a new political order. But for those who had lived behind the fences, memory remained deeply personal. The photographs did. As the years passed, the women who had once guarded their photographs behind barbed wire entered ordinary lives, shaped by quiet routines. Some married. Some rebuilt professions interrupted by war. Others lived modestly, rarely speaking about the years spent in captivity. But the photographs remained. They moved from envelopes to albums, from coat pockets to bedside drawers, from private keepsakes to family heirlooms. In many households, these images were never openly discussed. Children sometimes assumed they were ordinary wartime photos: a father in uniform, a mother standing beside a bicycle, siblings gathered before a house that no longer existed. Only later did descendants learn that those pictures had almost been taken away. That realization changed how families understood survival. Historians documenting prisoner-of-war policies often focused on logistics, numbers, transport routes, medical statistics, legal frameworks. The emotional dimension, the meaning of a photograph preserved during captivity, rarely appeared in official reports. Women POWs themselves occupied an even smaller space in historical narratives. Many records grouped them under broad administrative categories: auxiliaries, civilians, non-combatants. Their individual experiences disappeared into paperwork. As a result, the psychological significance of small mercies, such as allowing prisoners to keep family photographs, remained largely invisible. Yet oral histories recorded later revealed a common thread. Former prisoners described those images not as souvenirs, but as proof of existence. One woman recalled, "When everything else belonged to the camp, the picture still belonged to me." That quiet claim spoke volumes about dignity during defeat. By the 1960s and 1970s, attitudes toward wartime memory began to shift in both Germany and the United States. Scholars and journalists started collecting personal testimonies rather than relying solely on military records. Veterans groups encouraged storytelling. Universities launched oral history projects. Through these efforts, fragments surfaced. American personnel remembered how nervous prisoners became when personal items were inspected. Former POWs recalled the relief of hearing that photographs would be returned. None of these events altered strategy or politics, but together they revealed something deeper: that humane treatment could shape memory long after military outcomes were decided. The emotional resonance of those moments extended far beyond the fences where they occurred. The photographs themselves took on symbolic meaning. In post-war Germany, they represented continuity in a time of rupture, reminders of families fractured by displacement, bombardment, and loss. In American memory, they became subtle evidence that compassion could exist even between enemies. This quiet exchange helped reshape perceptions on both sides. As Europe rebuilt under new alliances, former adversaries gradually saw each other less through wartime propaganda and more through shared human experiences. The images that prisoners once clutched in fear became bridges between narratives. No single order or policy declared that photographs would preserve dignity. The decision to allow them often came down to individual officers, guards, or camp administrators interpreting regulations through human judgment. Those small choices created lasting consequences. Years later, some former guards expressed pride, not in battles fought, but in moments when they chose restraint or empathy. A former camp clerk reflected, "We couldn't give them freedom, but we could let them keep what reminded them who they were." Such memories reveal how war's aftermath is shaped as much by small acts as by grand political decisions. Today, historians examining POW experiences increasingly focus on emotional resilience and identity preservation. Personal possessions, letters, diaries, photographs, are recognized as crucial tools of psychological survival. For women prisoners especially, these objects often carried layered meanings: family responsibility, cultural identity, and hope for reunion. The photographs survived because they represented something armies could not fully control: memory. And memory, unlike territory, cannot be conquered. In later life, many women reportedly looked at those images differently. What once symbolized loss began to symbolize endurance. The faces captured in faded black and white were reminders that even in captivity, even when nations collapsed and ideologies failed, human connection remained intact. Some women eventually shared their stories with grandchildren, others never did. But the photographs persisted, silently passing through generations. They outlived camps, regimes, and the men who once fought over continents. And as the echoes of war faded into history, one truth remained clear. The aftermath was not only about rebuilding nations, but about how individuals carried memory forward.